Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. I felt a slight chill on my skin, despite the warm evening. The roof of our house, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, came alive with laughter and conversations. People gathered around tall tables, exchanging phrases, hugging upon meeting. But all of this was just background noise. Everything seemed distant, as if it wasn't happening to me. John stood a little farther away, engrossed in a conversation with his colleagues. I looked at him, but my gaze slid past. It was as if we had drifted to opposite sides of the party, each lost in our own world. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" His voice sounded sharp, almost like an echo in my head. John cast a quick glance at me, as if checking that I was still there. I nodded, smiled, but he had already turned back to his conversation. Perhaps it was at that moment that I felt like I wasn't really here. Stephen appeared next to me, as always, unexpectedly. His smile was a bit warmer than seemed appropriate, and his eyes lingered on mine just a little longer than a normal look would allow. "You seem a bit bored at your own party," he laughed softly, standing beside me. I shrugged, trying not to show my unease. Stephen always had a way of noticing things that others missed. It was no surprise that he had picked up on my mood this time, too. Maybe I should have left at that moment, but something held me back. Perhaps it was his attention, which suddenly felt so personal. Just, I hesitated, unable to find the right words. What could I say? That I felt like a stranger at a party thrown for my husband? That the people I considered friends were just his colleagues, and I couldn't truly connect with them? I said nothing. Stephen looked at me more intently, and his eyes, usually calm, now reminded me of still water before a storm. "You know, Julia, sometimes it feels like you don't allow yourself to be here, with us," he said, as if thinking out loud. His words were so soft that I didn't immediately grasp how deeply they resonated. I felt my hands involuntarily clench into fists. He knew how to touch on my sore spots, but his tone wasn't accusatory. Rather, it seemed as if he was offering me the chance to explain to myself why I felt this way. I I'm just tired." I tried to excuse myself, though I knew it wasn't entirely true. But explaining to him, or to myself, what exactly I was feeling, I couldn't. He nodded. His eyes softened, and a slight smile appeared on his face. It was as if he knew the answer better than I did. "You know, sometimes you can be a little selfish," he suddenly said, his voice dropping half a tone lower, as if addressing only me. "You deserve to feel comfortable, even if it means stepping away from all the rules you've made for yourself." Stephen's words felt almost like an invitation. Inside, a strange feeling began to grow, something warm and tugging. It pulsed somewhere deep, in the most hidden corners of my soul. The party continued its life. The clinking of glasses, toasts, and laughter. Everything around moved, but for the two of us, time seemed to have paused. We talked for a while longer, but our conversation slowly drifted off topic. Stephen spoke of his travels, joked, shared stories about meeting people. But none of it mattered. The real thing was happening inside me. I caught myself watching his lips, how they moved, and I wondered what he was feeling in that moment. My mind was filling with heavy thoughts I couldn't shake. When he looked at me again, there was a spark in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Something had shifted, as if a thin line had been crossed. I tried to hold on, to convince myself that this was all just my imagination, that everything was happening only in my head. But when his hand, almost accidentally, brushed against mine, everything changed. Just one moment, and I felt a light tremor run through my body. It was as if, with that touch, he had crossed the boundary that had previously only been a hint. I didn't pull my hand away, and in that moment, I realized that something was growing inside me, something I would find hard to control. We fell silent, and I felt the air between us grow heavier. Stephen stepped back, as if giving me a chance to return to reality, but I couldn't look away. I didn't know what to do next. The feeling was strange. It wasn't the fear I had expected to feel, but something else, something tempting, something I didn't even dare to name. I should have said something, left, done anything to break the invisible bridge stretching between us. But I couldn't. In that moment, I knew that everything would be different from that evening onward. Julia! John's voice suddenly brought me back to reality. I turned to see him waving, inviting me to join the group of people at the table. I nodded, trying to smile, but inside I could still feel that gaze burning into my back. I knew this was only the first step, and each one after would be harder to stop. After the rooftop party, I tried to forget Stephen's gaze, his touch, that unexpected jolt that ran through my body. But as the days passed, those memories refused to leave me. When John suggested accepting Stephen's dinner invitation, I felt a slight pang in my chest. I caught myself gripping the armrest of my chair, as if my body reacted faster than my mind. I agreed with a smile, but inside, a wave of anxiety rose, one I didn't yet know how to handle. Stephen's house always seemed cozy and warm to me. It stood in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees and a neatly kept garden. It was the kind of place that should have made me feel safe. And yet, today, as we stepped inside, I felt something different, a barely perceptible tension, as if the air in the room was a little heavier than usual. Stephen greeted us at the door with a warm smile, and his gaze briefly skimmed over me, almost imperceptible to others. But I noticed, and I had the sense that he knew I noticed too. Dinner started off calmly. John, as usual, talked about work, repeated jokes I had heard dozens of times, and laughed along with Stephen. But each time Stephen addressed me, I felt his attention, his eyes on me. At first, it was innocent, almost unnoticeable, just casual interest, friendly engagement. But with each new question, each new phrase, his compliments became more personal. "You look especially beautiful tonight, Julia," he said at one point, his voice softening, as if that compliment was meant only for me. I smiled in response, but felt something shift inside me. John didn't notice. He never picked up on things like that. We talked about life, about future plans, and I found myself slowly tuning John out, becoming fully absorbed in what Stephen was saying. His words, his tone, everything about him became compelling. I tried to resist the feeling, but every time our eyes met, it felt as if another invisible thread was being drawn between us. After dinner, Stephen offered to walk us to the car. I took it as part of his usual hospitality, but as soon as we stepped outside, something in him changed. The wind gently rustled the trees, and I heard their soft whispering above us. We walked toward the car, and I felt his gaze slowly shift to me, as if he was looking without hurrying to look away. When we reached the car, Stephen opened the door for me, and I sensed his presence far too close. John was saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. All I could hear was my own heartbeat and the strange, almost tender tension between us. Stephen leaned in a little closer, his gaze lingering on my face longer than it should have. For a few seconds, time froze. I felt something tighten inside me, as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff. It was so quiet that it seemed like the world had stopped, watching this moment unfold. I could have taken a step back. I could have laughed it off as if nothing had happened. I could have simply turned and gotten into the car. But I stood still, feeling his attention, this quiet but powerful pull. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," he said, and his voice sounded deeper than before. I couldn't pinpoint what exactly had changed, but it was there, something invisible, unspoken, but utterly real. I nodded, as though words were stuck in my throat. All I had to do was get in the car and leave. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened. Something I could no longer ignore, no matter how hard I tried. When I finally sat in the car, John started the engine and began talking about the upcoming work week. I heard his words, but they passed right through me. I stared out the window, watching Stephen's house slowly disappear around the bend, but my thoughts were still there. In that brief moment, when his gaze lingered on me longer than it should have, I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. But the truth was too clear. That evening had changed something inside me, the feeling that I was standing on the edge, from which there was no turning back. On Saturday morning, I suggested a walk in the park to John. He loved weekends like this, calm, measured, when we could just escape from everything and be together. But this time, things didn't go the way I had hoped. "Julia, I have urgent matters," John said, quickly buttoning his shirt. "I'll be back later, maybe in the evening." "Again?" The words slipped from my lips before I could stop myself. It had become a common thing for him. Urgent matters, work, calls. He turned around, giving me a quick look that said, "Sorry, but it has to be this way." I just nodded in response, not wanting to make a scene. There had been too many moments like this, where I said something, only to get the same tired, indifferent look in return. I knew he would leave soon, and I would be left alone. When the door closed behind John, the silence wrapped around the house. It was a familiar, almost comforting silence, but today it felt especially heavy. I decided that a walk in the park might be a good idea, even alone. The air was fresh, and the sun gently touched the earth. The park seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. I walked along the narrow path, among the trees and the cool shade, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Julia!" It was Stephen. His voice, as always, was soft, but this time it stirred a strange feeling in me, a mix of excitement and fear. I turned around and saw him, tall, confident, slightly relaxed, as if he too had just happened to end up in the park. "Stephen?" I smiled in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Taking a walk," he replied, walking closer. "Like you, I suppose." His smile was warm, almost carefree, but something in his eyes told me this wasn't just a coincidence. We started walking together, just chatting as usual. We talked about the weather, how fast time flies, small things. But soon, the conversation turned to more personal topics. "How are things with John?" he suddenly asked. His gaze fixed ahead, but I felt that his attention was entirely on me. "The usual," I shrugged, trying not to put too much emotion into the phrase. But even I knew there was a huge layer of unspoken feelings in those words. I didn't want to say too much, but Stephen was patient. "He's been working a lot, hasn't he?" he continued, as if studying me through his words. "Yeah, especially lately." I felt a strange tension rising inside. Conversations with him were always easier than with John, maybe because he listened. We kept walking until we reached a quiet pond surrounded by tall trees, shielding it from the noise of the city. I stopped, looking at the water. The surface was smooth, reflecting the clouds, just as it reflected my own thoughts. Stephen stood next to me, and the silence between us was almost tangible. "And you?" I suddenly asked, without thinking. "Don't you ever feel like all of this is just a game, where we try to meet some kind of expectations?" He looked at me in surprise, but there was something in his eyes, understanding, as if he often asked himself the same question. "I think about it a lot," he answered quietly. "Marriage is such a complicated thing. Everyone talks about love, about duty, but sometimes it feels like we just lose ourselves in this routine." His words were so close to what I felt that I couldn't help but reflect on them. This was more than just a conversation. "Have you ever felt like you're suffocating?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the pond. He slowly nodded. "Yes," he replied, his voice almost a whisper. "Often. And in those moments, I just want to break free, feel something real, something alive." I turned my head and met his gaze. In that moment, everything fell into place. What I had been feeling for the past weeks suddenly became clear. I knew this meeting wasn't a coincidence, and I knew that we were both standing on the edge, where a choice had to be made. Our eyes met, and there was something more than just friendship in that look. Stephen slowly stepped closer, his hand lightly brushing mine, as if by accident, but the touch wasn't accidental. I felt the warmth of his fingers on my skin, and it ignited the very fire I had been trying to suppress for so long. Julia! His voice was low, soft, almost pleading. He leaned toward me, and in the next second, his lips were near mine. I could have stopped it. I could have stepped back, done something to put everything back in its place. But I didn't. His lips touched mine, and the world around us froze. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a moment of truth. I felt the tension that had built between us over the days finally break through. His hands gently wrapped around my waist, and I didn't resist. Inside, everything was boiling, as if I were standing at the edge of a cliff from which there was no return. We pulled away from each other, but stood in silence for a long time. We both knew that something more had happened than just physical contact. This was a turning point, something that changed everything. I shouldn't have, Stephen whispered, his breath heavy. But you did, I replied, my words sounding more confident than I actually felt. The silence between us stretched for a few moments, and each of those moments felt like an eternity. What now? He whispered, but I didn't have an answer. I only knew one thing. This kiss was just the beginning of something that couldn't be stopped anymore. After Stephen and I kissed by the pond, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. It felt like a dream, a reality I didn't want to be in, yet couldn't ignore. Returning to my usual life seemed impossible. Every time John spoke to me or held me, I remembered that kiss. I recalled the warmth of Stephen's hands, his voice as he whispered my name. And each time, I felt a strange sensation, a mix of guilt and desire. For several days, I tried to suppress the memory, pretending that nothing had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, it became increasingly difficult. Every message from Stephen, every short call only deepened my confusion. I felt like we were walking on thin ice, and at any moment, that ice could crack beneath us. One morning, I received a message from him. Julia, I know you need to get away from everything. I have a house outside the city. Why don't we spend the day there? Just relax. Talk. I stared at the phone screen for a long time, unsure of what to reply. The words seemed innocent enough, but I knew that this day wouldn't be a simple escape. We both knew there was much more behind this offer, yet curiosity and a deep inner pull won out. I responded briefly, okay. When I arrived at Stephen's country house, I immediately felt strange. The house stood on a hill, surrounded by dense forest, with a terrace that overlooked a calm lake. It seemed like a place created specifically for seclusion, for escaping from the world. I didn't know what to expect, but everything inside me told me that this day would change everything. Stephen greeted me at the door with a wide smile, but I could see the tension in his eyes, the same tension I felt. He invited me inside, and I could feel the walls of this house, much like our conversation, slowly closing in, turning everything into something more personal and intimate. We sat on the terrace, drinking tea, and at first, everything seemed calm. Stephen talked about how he often came here to be alone with his thoughts, how this place helped him relax and find answers to the questions that haunted him. But despite the calm, there was an underlying depth to his words. We both knew this conversation was only a prelude to what was really going to happen. Do you think about it often? He suddenly asked, interrupting his thoughts. His voice was soft, but there was a question beneath it that had been building up for a long time. He didn't specify what it was, but he didn't need to. We both knew he was talking about that kiss by the pond, about our sudden closeness. Yes, I answered, unable to lie. Inside, everything tightened at those words. at the admission that the moment had changed not only my thoughts, but also how I saw myself and my life. Stephen paused for a moment, as if considering my words, then quietly added, I think about it every day too. That kiss, it wasn't just a mistake. I felt my heart race. I didn't know what to say, but his words knocked me off balance. Something inside me broke, and I realized that I could no longer deny the obvious. It's wrong, I finally forced out, though the words sounded unconvincing even to me. Wrong? He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with emotion. Then what's right? Living by rules we create for ourselves, or allowing ourselves to feel something real, something that turns your whole world upside down? I remained silent. He was voicing the thoughts I had been afraid to think aloud. The thoughts I had been trying to suppress were now bursting to the surface, and I could no longer hold them back. We stood up, and I walked to the edge of the terrace, staring at the lake. The water was quiet, calm, like my life before this moment. But inside me, a storm was raging. I sensed Stephen approaching closer. His presence was almost palpable, like electricity in the air. Julia! He said my name again, and there was so much warmth in his voice that I couldn't hold back any longer. I turned to him, and in that moment, everything changed. Words no longer mattered. We both knew that the line we had tried to maintain had been crossed. His hands gently touched my waist, and I felt a wave building inside me, ready to break free. His lips touched mine again, but this time it was different. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a confession that we couldn't stop what had begun. I felt my hands sliding over his shoulders, his body growing closer, warmer, and the entire world disappeared beyond the borders of this moment. Are you sure you want this? I asked softly, pulling away for a brief second. There's only one thing I want, he replied, his breath mixing with mine. I want to be with you. I knew there was no turning back. We both knew it. And in that moment, all that was left was to surrender to the feelings that had been tearing us apart from the inside. Time seemed to stop, and the world narrowed down to just the two of us. The only thing that mattered was what was happening between us, here and now. After that day at the country house, I felt like I was walking on thin ice. At first, there was a strange sense of relief, like I had freed myself from something oppressive, from a burden I had been carrying on my shoulders for a long time. But then came another feeling, anxiety. I tried to return to normal life, but it felt like walking in the dark. I knew that something inside me had changed forever. When I returned home, John was the same as always. Immersed in his work, conversations with clients, endless calls. We had dinner together, but there was nothing real in our conversations. I listened to him, nodded when he talked about some meetings, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Stephen. Are you okay? John suddenly asked during dinner, catching me off guard with his question. Yes, just a bit tired, I replied, trying to make my voice as calm as possible. He nodded, returning to his discussion of business, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. He hadn't noticed anything. Or maybe he just didn't want to. A few days passed, and I did everything I could to distance myself from thoughts of Stephen. I busied myself with housework, met up with friends, but it felt like a battle with my own mind. I couldn't forget his touch, his gaze, the passion that had sparked between us. One afternoon, I decided to stop by my favorite cafe in the city center. It was a quiet place, with large windows where I could hide from the bustle and simply enjoy a cup of coffee. I was sitting by the window, lost in thought, when I heard a familiar voice. Julia! I looked up and saw Stephen. He was standing at the entrance to the cafe, a faint smile playing on his lips, the kind that could drive me crazy in an instant. Stephen! I froze, not knowing how to react. My heart suddenly began to beat faster. May I sit? His voice was soft, almost gentle. There was so much unspoken in that simple question. I could have said no. I could have just stood up and left. But instead, I nodded, and he sat down across from me, placing his hands on the table. We sat in silence for a few seconds, and the tension between us was almost palpable. "How are you?" he finally asked, his eyes studying my face, as if trying to read my thoughts. "I'm fine," I answered shortly, but my words sounded uncertain. Stephen leaned in slightly closer, his expression turning serious. "You don't look like you're fine," he said, and his voice was so confident that I felt something tighten inside me. I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap, and sighed. "Stephen, I'm trying to get back to normal," I said quietly, finally allowing myself to speak. "But every time I think it's over, I remember that day. I can't. Just forget." He listened intently, and I could see his face soften. "I can't forget either," he said after a brief pause. "Julia, what happened? It wasn't an accident. We both know that." I looked up sharply, meeting his gaze. Two voices were battling inside me, one telling me I needed to get up and leave, the other pulling me toward him with every passing moment. "Do you think this is something important?" I finally asked, almost afraid of the answer. He looked me straight in the eye. "Yes, Julia, I think it's important." His words were filled with a confident tenderness. "And I think you feel it just as much as I do." I was silent, trying to find the strength to say something, but every sentence seemed meaningless. Inside me, everything was turning upside down. I knew I needed to leave, but something kept me rooted in place. "Julia, I don't want to force you to make a decision, but I can't pretend that nothing happened." Stephen spoke softly, but there was so much sincerity in his voice that I could no longer ignore my feelings. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my heart, which was pounding as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. "I just don't know what to do," I finally confessed. It was hard, but I knew that honesty was the only way to deal with what I was feeling. "We can just talk," he suggested, his voice lowering slightly. "There's no need to make any decisions right now. But don't push this away, Julia. You deserve to understand what you're feeling." Our conversation gradually flowed into more personal topics. We talked again about how hard it was to be in a marriage, when everything felt like routine, when emotions went unnoticed. I couldn't disagree with his words, because they mirrored what was happening in my life. "Are you happy with John?" Stephen suddenly asked, and there was something in his voice that I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps a hint of jealousy. I I don't know." I spoke the truth, though the words were hard to get out. I didn't want to lie, didn't want to pretend that everything was fine when there was a storm raging inside me. Stephen remained silent for a few seconds, as if considering my answer. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," he said, leaning in a bit closer. "But you should know one thing: I'm here. And if you ever need someone who truly understands you, you know where to find me." We fell silent again, and I didn't know what to say. At that moment, I realized that there were no longer any invisible boundaries between us. Every look, every phrase from him was an invitation into a world I found harder and harder to resist. When I returned home, my mind was filled with thoughts. Our conversation at the cafe had been simple, but there was something much deeper hidden beneath it. We both knew it wasn't just a random encounter. In recent weeks, it felt like my entire life had turned into a play, where I was playing multiple roles at once. With John, I was the devoted wife, caring and attentive. With Stephen, I was a woman yearning to break free from the ordinary, craving something more. But no matter how hard I tried to keep these two lives separate, they began to intertwine. I started noticing that John was looking at me with suspicion more and more often, noticing my absences, asking questions. "Where were you?" he asked one evening when I came home late. I froze at the doorway, trying to come up with an excuse, but my mind was blank. I I met up with a friend," I lied, feeling the words spill from my lips too quickly. John frowned, his eyes glinting with distrust. "A friend?" he repeated, and there was a note of skepticism in his voice that I hadn't noticed before. Yes, I shrugged, trying not to appear too anxious. We just decided to sit in a cafe. Nothing special. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied with my answer. There was something new in his gaze, something I hadn't noticed before. Maybe he hadn't paid attention before, but now everything was different. Fear stirred inside me. I realized that John was beginning to suspect something, and it was inevitable. The next few days passed in tension. I tried to avoid conversations that could lead to any kind of confession, but John started asking more and more questions. He grew colder, his glances more scrutinizing. I felt like he was watching my every move. One of those days, when I felt like I couldn't bear the tension any longer, Stephen called me. His voice was calm, as always, but I could sense that he, too, suspected something. "Julia, I think we should meet. I miss you," he said, and there was so much warmth in his words that I couldn't resist. We agreed to meet in the park, at the very spot where our relationship had once started to turn into something more. I knew it was risky, but something inside me drew me to Stephen, like a magnet. When I arrived at the park, Stephen was already waiting for me by the pond. His face was calm, as always, and I immediately felt a slight sense of relief, as if, for a few moments, the entire world had disappeared. "You look tense," he noted as I approached. "John suspects something," I confessed, trying not to meet his eyes. Stephen was silent for a moment, then leaned in closer to me. "Are you sure?" His voice was quiet, but there was concern in it. "Yes," I answered, feeling my heart start to beat faster. "He's watching me. I can feel it." Stephen nodded, his expression turning serious. "We need to be more careful," he said, placing his hand on my shoulder. His touch was warm, but at that moment, I felt something else, fear, growing inside me. We sat on the bench, silently staring at the water, when he suddenly leaned in and kissed me gently. In that moment, all my worries vanished. I was completely lost in his warmth, forgetting everything that might be happening around us. The entire world narrowed down to that one kiss, and I could no longer fight it. But as we pulled away from each other, I suddenly felt that something was wrong. I glanced around, and in the distance, behind the trees, a familiar face flashed. John. My heart stopped. He stood nearby, in the shadow of the trees, watching us. His face was pale, his eyes empty. I realized that he had seen everything, the kiss, the way we held hands. The world around me began to shake. I didn't know what to do, what to say. John turned and walked away silently. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move. Everything inside me collapsed. I knew that now, everything would change. The house, which once was my refuge, now seemed foreign and cold. Every wall, every corner screamed of me, of my life with John, of what I had lost. I stood at the door, trying to gather my thoughts that scattered like shards of glass. My heart pounded in my chest so loudly that I could barely breathe. I knew I needed to go inside, that I had to talk to him, to ask for forgiveness. But how? How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? Finally, I took a step forward, and the key turned in the lock with a dry, sharp sound. The silence of the house, once cozy, now weighed heavily on me. I walked into the living room and saw John sitting on the couch. He looked as if he had been waiting for me. His face was stone-like, with no trace of the warmth that once lived in his eyes. I stopped at the doorway, too hesitant to approach. "John." My voice came out hoarse, as if I hadn't spoken for days. He lifted his gaze to me, and in his eyes, there was nothing but coldness and disappointment. I felt a sharp pain twist inside me. "Why are you here, Julia?" His voice was even, too calm for the storm I had expected. "What do you want to say?" I took a step forward, but his stare seemed to pierce through me, holding me in place. I want to apologize," I whispered, gathering all my strength to keep from breaking down. "I made a terrible mistake. I let you down, I failed our marriage, but Please, John, listen to me. He was silent, and in that silence, I heard my hope die. I don't want to hear any more of your apologies, he finally said, rising from the couch. His movements were slow, as if he was completely drained. You've ruined everything. Our life. Everything we built. It doesn't mean anything anymore. I stepped closer, hoping I could somehow reach his heart. Please, John, give me a chance to explain. I know I was wrong. I know what I did. But it's not what I wanted. He turned sharply toward me, and in his eyes, I saw the anger. The very anger he had been holding back for all these days. Not what you wanted? He almost laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. You cheated on me with my father, Julia. You betrayed me in the most disgusting way possible. And you think you can just come here and fix everything? His words hit me like a whip, burning every part of me. I felt the walls of the room closing in on me, everything that had once been solid now crumbling under the weight of my mistakes. John, I love you. I made a mistake, but that doesn't change how I feel about you. I tried to reach out to him, but he stepped back, as if my closeness repulsed him. Love me? He laughed again, but now it was a cold, cruel laugh. You have no idea what that means. If you loved me, you would never have done what you did. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, and tears began to stream down my face. I couldn't hold them back anymore. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm only asking you to forgive, I said, but my words were filled with desperation. John shook his head, as if he had already made his final decision. No, Julia, I can't forgive you, and I don't want to see you in my life anymore. His voice was like a sentence, final and irreversible. John, please, I whispered, feeling my legs buckle under me from the helplessness. But he was unmoved. I've filed for divorce, he said coldly, and those words pierced me like a knife. I couldn't believe it had come to this. I don't want to see you or hear from you ever again. And you know what? I don't want anything to do with my father either, he added, and in his voice I heard deep hatred. He's nothing to me now. You've destroyed not just our marriage, but my relationship with him as well. John's words left me empty. I stood there, feeling my life fall apart around me. Everything I had once known, everything I had tried to save, was gone. He turned away from me, his shoulders trembling, but he wouldn't look back. Leave, Julia, he whispered. Just leave and don't come back. I stood in that cold, silent room, unable to believe that this was truly the end. I wanted to say something, to take a step, to change something, but there was nothing left that could undo what had been done. In the end, I turned around and, without looking at him, walked out the door. The lock clicked shut, and I was left outside, alone, with an empty soul. As I stepped out of John's house, the cold air hit me like the world itself was pushing me away. I wandered through the empty streets, not knowing where to go. It felt as if each step echoed in the hollow space of my heart. All that was left for me was to seek comfort in Stephen. He was my only salvation, the only person who could understand me. I hoped, at least, that he would support me, help me get through this pain. I didn't call him right away. Something inside me sensed that this conversation wouldn't bring me the solace I so desperately sought. But I couldn't be alone. I needed his words, his reassurance, and when I finally dialed his number, my fingers trembled like never before. The phone rang, and after a few long rings, I heard his voice. Julia? His voice was restrained, colder than I had expected. Stephen, we need to talk. I heard the tremor in my voice, but I couldn't control it. He went silent for a moment, and the silence was agonizing. About what? His voice was even, with no hint of the warmth that once existed between us. About us. About what happened. I took a deep breath, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I can't go back home anymore. John threw me out. We're getting divorced. Stephen was silent again. I could feel the tension building in the air, and with each passing second, I realized more and more that this conversation wasn't going to go the way I had hoped. Julia, I can't continue this, he finally said, and his words struck me like a blow. I froze, not understanding what he meant. What do you mean? My voice grew weaker, almost a whisper. Law, it's over between us, he said, and there was no regret or pain in his voice. He spoke with a cold certainty, as if he had long made this decision. I have to fix what I broke. I need to repair my relationship with John. He's my son, and that's what matters most. Those words pierced me to my core. I had expected anything but this. Inside me, everything shattered, and I felt the world crumble around me, even more painfully than when John had thrown me out. You can't leave me. Not now, I whispered, barely holding back tears. I've ruined everything for us. I've lost my family. Stephen sighed, and his voice remained as cold as ever. I know, Julia. His words were distant, as if he were speaking to a stranger. But it was a mistake. I thought this is what I wanted. But now I realize I need to get my son back. For our future, and what about me? I could no longer hold back the tears. You're just going to leave me alone? He didn't answer right away. All I could hear was his heavy breathing on the other end of the line. It seemed like he was struggling too, but his decision was final. I'm sorry, Julia, he finally said, and there wasn't a drop of hope in his voice. But I have to fix what can still be saved. The call ended. I stood there on the street, clutching my phone like it was the last anchor in this sea of despair. But that anchor had disappeared, leaving me alone with my pain, with the emptiness. Stephen had chosen his son. John had chosen his pride. And I was left alone, lost in my guilt. I sat on a bench, feeling myself slowly dissolve into this cold, foreign world. Everything I had, everything that once seemed so important, was gone. I had destroyed my life, John's life, and even the relationship between father and son, all for moments that now seemed empty and meaningless. I had never felt so alone. Even when John was distant, I held on to some hope, some sense of stability. But now I had nothing left. Stephen, the man I had trusted, the man for whom I had committed this betrayal, had turned away from me as easily as John had. I realized I had made an irreversible mistake. Not only had I ruined my own life, but I had also ruined the lives of those I cared about. Every step I took, every choice I made, had led to this moment, this utter loneliness, this destruction from which there was no escape. I sat there, my arms wrapped around myself, and quietly cried. The world was no longer a place where I could find comfort. All that remained inside me was pain, and I didn't know how to live with it any longer.